Welcome to Engaging Truth. This is Dave Schultz, one of your hosts. The other is sitting to my left, my faithful friend, John Cain. Welcome, John. I just pray that our work tonight will be truly blessed because we have a guest I've known for 20 years. And we'll welcome him to the mic in just a minute. And his name is John Krueger. John Krueger serves as Director of Choir and Music at Christ the Servant Lutheran Church in Houston. Over the years, he has sung with the Houston Grand Opera, the Houston Gilbert and Sullivan Society, and many others. He recently completed a Certificate of Liturgical Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Quite an impressive line of things that you're doing, John.
It keeps me out of trouble. That's the important part.
Well, we're gonna really look at something that you, by God's grace, we're just kind of moved to do, and that is a new program every Sunday night here on KKHT at the 6 o'clock slot. First of all, welcome, and second of all, would you talk a little bit about what brought you there to begin with, and what your plans are?
Well, several years ago, I'd actually talked some with Brian Runge, who works here at KKHT. And he kind of said he wished that somebody would do a show on Martin Luther, and we just kind of left it there. And sure enough, I came in to do some advertising last fall, and Brian asked me again, and I guess I was crazy enough to say yes. And what we're going to do with this is take a look at Martin Luther's work, his writings, his life, his Reformation, although that was probably more God's Reformation, and certainly his music. As a musician, I can't avoid that.
So what would you say to our listeners who are not Lutheran, why they should tune in?
Martin Luther, he made a huge difference across a lot of areas. He, in some ways, changed the face of congregational singing. He started a spate of hymn writing that hasn't stopped. His translation of the Bible standardized written German. His reforms of the church, he wanted to be a reformer, not necessarily start a thing called the Lutheran Church. But his reforms, in many ways, were common sense. In many ways, were informed by the Bible. And in some way, his being able to get the message out was as a result of the printing press.
Right.
So, his message still resonates.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to go ahead and do something with it.
Yeah, very worthy. Of course, we're Lutheran, so we think so, but historians have, called him the first modern man and the father of public education and so many other things that touch many, many other areas outside of religion. But for us, religion is number one.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to, and the clear preaching of the gospel, which wasn't happening in the church at this time.
Well, define what you mean by gospel.
Well, let's see here. I guess we would call it, and amazingly enough, when we were talking about evangelical Lutheran ministries, the Greek word evangelion, good news. Mm-hmm. And very simply, the fact that there is some good news in our lost condition.
Yeah.
When you look at the studies that you've done so far and the reading of Luther, been a lot of surprises for you as you read this stuff in preparation for the programs in the future. What surprises you most as a historian and as a musician about what you've read about him?
I think one of the surprising things is, as we know, Luther could get crabby. And there's some writings that are pretty rough that I'm going to have to address. At some point, I'm going to have to take them on head on. There was, in spite of a feeling that he was actually pretty depressed a lot of the time, somewhere down deep, there's an absolute joy in his music. Those two things jump right out at me. His humanness jumps right out at me. I've taped a show to be broadcast a little bit in the future about his barber. And Luther's help, not only in terms of teaching him how to pray, but Luther's help to keep him out of the executioner's chair a little bit later on. and just the flat out humanness. Yeah, there was no pretension about it, and I think that's what I love about it.
Well, in the future, what kind of programs are you going to outline for us? Because I'm interested in going back to my Luther studies and studying, but if I can listen to you and find out stuff that I've forgotten, I would enjoy that too. What are in your plans for, like, program number 2, program number 3, and so forth?
Program 2 and 3 is actually going to be kind of a history of Luther's work leading up to and the first couple of years of the Reformation. For that matter, the work he did while under house arrest. The work he did in beginning to translate lots of things into German. The work he did getting the basics of the faith into the hands of the people, and for that matter, the people who were supposed to be teaching it. And of course, the music. He had his hymns. He didn't redo the Catholic Mass per se, but he translated that into German. He started with the baptism rite so that people could actually understand what was happening when people were being baptized into the Christian faith. So I'll be covering that. There is this very rough pamphlet to deal with called The Jews and Their Lies, which was written very late in his life. That is almost at odds with stuff that he wrote earlier in his career and a little bit that he wrote at the very end of his career, at the end of his life for that matter. And I'm going to have to take it on just because so many people, particularly in this day and age, glom on to what is his nastiest writing. And sometimes the only thing you really can do is face it head on. Right. Both the ELCA and now the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has renounced that writing.
Yeah.
And with good reason.
Well, Luther lived 500 years ago. There's no political correctness of any kind back then from anyone, whether it's, the Pope or any of the reformers or politicians of their day. They were just a very crude, earthy bunch. And we also need to say that Luther, although we believe that he was used by God, his writings are not at the same level as the Bible. I mean, it's not divinely inspired. So we can talk about Luther, and I'd also like you to look at the book by Netto, Uwe Simon Netto, about the experiences that Luther had. He said one thing, but sometimes he did another.
Yes. I had the pleasure of actually meeting Uwe about a year ago.
Good.
And it was at a conference where we talked quite a bit about that.
Right.
And, Luther sometimes was of two minds, as we all are.
Yeah.
Sometimes he would change his mind. I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson, talked about, consistency being the hobgoblin of little minds or something like that.
Yeah.
And there are times he just wasn't consistent. But at the end of the day, he wasn't a systematic theologian either. Yet he was a teacher, he was a professor of Bible, he was a preacher, and a very good one. He was a musician, and a pretty good one.
Yeah. The way I've heard it said was that Luther went into a meeting with some Jewish folks trying to tell them the good news about Jesus, and they tried to tell him the good news of being Jewish, and he didn't take it well. So anyway, we can all get riled up.
Oh yeah.
When you look at the history that you have read, and you described some of the delightful things, what troubles you most about what you have read that you need to address beside this issue of the Jewish people?
I think one thing that I need to address is, well, maybe two things, and they're related. That is that for Luther, the devil was very real, and maybe, too real for his own good. The other thing I'm going to address, and it was probably what set in motion the bad stuff, setting in motion the good stuff of the Reformation, was the fact that he never felt forgiven. It took him many, many years, even after the dawn of the Reformation, to get to a place where he felt that, that he was forgiven for the stuff that he'd done along the way. And that's one, I guess, on a personal level, I feel that a lot myself. And maybe that's part of what resonates with me, is that, as I read Luther and I see some of the things, I can sit there and say, yeah, I know that guy, maybe too well.
The whole issue of forgiveness, why, in your knowledge of reading and your knowledge of Luther and your own life, why is that the issue of forgiveness difficult to just grab onto and run with it?
I think part of it is with him coming out of the Catholic tradition. And I guess maybe the best way to approach it is something that most of the rest of the Protestant church today doesn't ever mess with. And that is the notion of penance and purgation, that we have to do something to gain forgiveness of sins. Now, in the real world, there certainly are things that we need to do. Like if I go and rob a bank, I would expect that I would have to serve some jail time. If I stole money from somebody, I would certainly expect to have to return it, and perhaps with interest. But the idea that forgiveness comes from something other than God that can be tricky. And for that matter, it's kind of all over the recovery community, where you have steps that talk about making amends. And it's very weird because the recovery literature, there was only one page that talked, in the big book, for example, it talks about forgiveness. And it certainly talks about a changed life. It talks about doing things differently. It talks for setting things right as we need to. But it doesn't necessarily talk about forgiveness. And it took it took a lot of work for me to feel that some of the stuff I've done over the years was forgivable and forgiven.
Yeah. That picture of Luther as a person who wanted to reform, maybe you can help our listeners understand. My shorthand way of describing to people what Luther attempted to do was, as a 16th century German attempting to take the Christian church back to its roots, back to the first 800 or so years. Is that along the lines with what you're finding?
Very much so. Luther, in a lot of his writing, quoted what we would call the Church Fathers. And I think we could go even back further than 800 years prior. He was an Augustinian monk. So St. Augustine certainly played a big role. He was not a fan of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
So he went back to earlier models.
Just the first 800 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
For example, one absolutely lovely Advent hymn, "The Savior of the Nations Come," he stole, translated the lyrics from Ambrose of Milan from about 400 AD.
Mm-hmm.
So, he was not above working with the Church Fathers.
But he wasn't really radical then either. He was showing the roots of Christianity and trying to forcefully move the Christian church back. Describe the scene in Luther's day that showed how things had been obscured, how the truth, how the Bible, how the original ways had been glossed over.
I think part of that comes to perhaps a lack of access to the literature. It's sometimes said that Luther was a creature of the printing press. Up until that time, there may actually be some truth to the rumor that the Bible that he had to work with was chained in the library. It was very beautiful Bible. It was what we call an illuminated manuscript, which was written, drawn, if you will, by hand. And there just weren't very many books around. That all changed about 30 years before he was born with the invention of the printing press. And crazy as it seems, even his music was affected by that, because typesetting for music was developed in 1500. So that ability to get stuff out to people made a huge difference. Now, maybe not as huge as we would like to think, because all of these wonderful pamphlets and translations of the Bible and catechisms and 95 theses went out to a public that only 1 in 5 people could read. And that was the other reason for his music, was to be able to put this information into people's ears. And, people's ears that couldn't and would never read it. Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect. Yeah, and I think it was a combination of, perhaps the lack of literacy and certainly the lack of availability. I mentioned in the first show this evening that Luther standardized written German. Mm-hmm. It was his Bible translation that did that. And if I'm picking up a piece of paper that looks like somebody from my town wrote it, that's fine. If I pick up a piece of paper that somebody from, say, Conroe wrote, and it doesn't look anything like written German, I've got a problem.
Right. There's something like 300 dialects at one time that he standardized?
Yes.
So we like to hear about Luther because we see him as a person who opened the door to renewal and getting back to basics, but also getting close to God. What would you tell our listeners was the source of Luther's strength?
I think the source of Luther's strength may have been his intellectual honesty, even if he changed his mind on a regular basis, and also the fact that he never, in spite of being very, very educated for his time, he never lost touch with being able to communicate with people. He was not nobility. His father was a mine owner. And Martin Luther was the first person in his family to get any kind of education. So, he really was of the earth. He came from, shall we say, common folk. And I think, in keeping with the basics, I recommend so highly going right back to the small catechism. I had to memorize the small catechism as a child, of course going to a Lutheran grade school, but I remain in love with that little document.
So for our listeners who's never heard of a small catechism, what is it? What does it contain?
It contains the basics of the Christian faith in question and answer form. Maybe like Jeopardy in reverse. But he takes on, in a very simple way, the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, baptism, confession and forgiveness, which is sometimes attached to baptism, and then the Lord's Supper, communion. Communion can be a little bit tricky because there are certainly several ways of looking at it, sometimes even within the Lutheran Church, but certainly within different denominations. So, I like the idea of sacrament, if I'm going to break up the word, calling it a holy thing.
Yeah. But that also provides a number of Bible verses, so people get not only question and answer, but it's informed and it's footnoted as referenced.
Yes, it is. And then there's this little thing called Table of Duties, which still pretty much applies today. He doesn't necessarily have a table of duties for nuclear physicists, but for people to live more or less at peace with one another, he's got a pretty good little outline for that.
Yeah. Well, Luther lived in a time of wars, of plagues, of a lot of death. and also a lot of misunderstanding of what our place is with respect to God. And so those lessons are lessons that it would help everyone to know, to give structure and hope, divine hope to your life.
Yes. Even in his discussion of the Ten Commandments, you hear a lot of gospel in a discussion of law. And of course, as Lutherans, we get to play with that distinction of law and gospel quite a bit. But, to not have it merely as a set of rules, except for one rule, and that is, his explanation of every commandment, you should fear and love God, not necessarily be afraid of God, but fear and love God, going right back to the first commandment. If there's one thing to do right, that was it.
Yeah, respect and love God.
If Luther were here in the room, and he's not, if he was here, we've got a minute to talk about this, so just do it quickly. What would he be saying to us about the gospel as he would hear it presented in the 21st century?
I think that his response to the gospel, as it's now presented, might still be back to basics. I had a friend once point out that it's all there in black and white, read the black. But, getting back to the basics of the message. It's not about a whole lot of other things, shall we say, attached to the word or to the church. And I'm not going to go into that because it's not my job to trash other people. But I think with Luther, it would be getting back to the basics of the gospel and getting back to the basics of being right with God without having to do a whole lot of things.
Jesus did it all for us. He made it possible for us to know him and have confidence. Join us again next time for Engaging Truth, and thank you, John, for being with us tonight. Good night now.